handprints in the mirrors, footsteps on the stairs, mysterious smells, vanishing objects, death by poison, hangings, murder, and gunfire. The Myrtles Plantation in the West Feliciana town of St. Francisville, Louisiana, holds the rather dubious record of hosting more ghostly phenomena than just about any other house in the country. But what could be more dubious than the honor itself? That would be the questionable history that has been presented to explain why the house is so haunted in the first place. Long acclaimed as one of the most haunted houses in America, the Myrtles attracts an almost endless stream of visitors each year, and many of them come in search of ghosts. There seems to be little doubt about the fact that the house is haunted. It's the reason that it's haunted that has been called into question. For several generations, owners and guides at the plantation have been presenting facts and history that they know is blatantly false. The Myrtles, according to hundreds of people who have encountered the resident spirits, is indeed haunted, but not for the reasons that we have been told. It was a simple check of historical records that revealed the real story. The true story of the Myrtles may not be as glamorous as the story presented by the staff at the plantation, but it is certainly strange. The history of the plantation is filled with death, tragedy, and despair, leading us to wonder why a fanciful history was created in its place. The Myrtles Plantation was constructed by David Bradford in 1794, and since that time, has allegedly been the scene of at least 10 murders. In truth, though, only one person was ever murdered there, but, as has been stated already, some of the people who have owned the house have never let the truth stand in the way of a good story. But as the reader will soon discover, the plantation has an unusual history that genuinely did occur, one that may, and likely has, left its own real ghosts behind. David Bradford was one of 5 children born in America to Irish immigrants. In 1777, he purchased a tract of land and a small stone house near Washington County, Pennsylvania. He became a successful attorney, businessman, and deputy attorney general for the county. His first attempt to marry ended only days before his wedding. No details are known about this, but he later met and married Elizabeth Porter in 1785 and started a family. As his family and business grew, Bradford needed a larger home, and he built a new one in the town of Washington. The house became well known in the region for its size and remarkable craftsmanship, with a mahogany staircase and woodwork imported from England. Many of the items had to be transported from the East Coast and over the Pennsylvania mountains at great expense. Bradford would use the parlor of the house as an office, where he would meet with his clients. October 1794, he was forced to flee, leaving his family behind. Bradford became involved in the infamous Whiskey Rebellion, and legend has it that George Washington placed a price on the man's head for his role in the affair. The Whiskey Rebellion took place in western Pennsylvania and began as a series of grievances over high prices and taxes forced on those living along the frontier at that time. The complaints eventually erupted into violence when a mob attacked and burned down the home of a local tax collector. In the months that followed, residents resisted attacks that had been placed on whiskey, and while most of the protests were nonviolent, Washington mobilized a militia and sent it in to suppress the rebellion. Once the protests were brought under control, Bradford left the region on the advice of some of the other principals in the affair. After leaving Washington, Bradford first went to Pittsburgh. Leaving his family in safety, he traveled down the Ohio River to the Mississippi. He eventually settled at Bayou Sara, near what is now Street Francisville, Louisiana. Bradford was no stranger to this area. He had originally traveled here in 1792 to try and obtain a land grant from Spain. When he returned in 1796, he purchased 600 acres of land and a year later, built a modest, 8-room home near Baton Rouge that he named Laurel Grove. He lived there alone until 1799, when he received a pardon for his role in the Whiskey Rebellion from newly elected President John Adams. He was given the pardon for his assistance in establishing a boundary line, known historically as Ellicott's Line, between Spain and the United States. After receiving the pardon, Bradford returned to Pennsylvania to bring his wife and 5 children back to Louisiana. He brought them to live at Bayou Sara, and they settled into a comfortable life there. Bradford occasionally took in students who wanted to study the law. One of them, Clark Woodruff, not only earned a law degree but also married his teacher's daughter, Sarah Matilda. Clark Woodruff at Laurel Grove. Clark Woodruff was born in Litchfield County, Connecticut, in August 1791. Having no desire to follow in his father's footsteps as a farmer, he left Connecticut at the age of 19 and sought his fortune on the Mississippi River, ending up in Bayou Sara. He arrived in 1810, the same year that citizens of the Feliciana parish rose up in revolt against the Spanish garrison at Baton Rouge. They overthrew the Spanish and then set up a new territory, with its capital being St. Francisville. The territory extended from the Mississippi River as far east as the Perdido River, near Mobile, Alabama. Still seeking to make his fortune, Woodruff placed an advertisement in the St. Francisville newspaper, the Timepiece, in the summer of 1811. He informed the public that an academy would be opening on the first Monday in September for the reception of students. He planned to offer English, grammar, astronomy, geography, elocution, composition, penmanship, and Greek and Latin. The academy was apparently short-lived, for in 1814, he joined Colonel Hyde's cavalry regiment from the Feliciana parish to fight alongside Andrew Jackson at the Battle of New Orleans. When the War of 1812 had ended, Woodruff returned to St. Francisville with the intention of studying law. He began his studies with Judge David Bradford and soon earned his degree. He also succumbed to the charms of the Bradford daughter, the lovely Sarah Matilda. Their romance blossomed under the shade of the crepe myrtle trees that reportedly gave the home its lasting name. The young couple was married on November 19, 1817, and for their honeymoon, Woodruff took his new bride to the Hermitage, the Tennessee home of his friend, Andrew Jackson. After the death of David Bradford, Woodruff managed Laurel Grove for his mother-in-law, Elizabeth. He expanded the holdings of the plantation and planted about 650 acres of indigo and cotton. Together, he and Sarah Matilda had 3 children, Cornelia Gale, James, and Mary Octavia. Tragically, their happiness would not last. On July 21, 1823, Sarah Matilda died after contracting yellow fever. The disease was spread through a number of epidemics that swept through Louisiana in those days. Hardly a family in the region went untouched by tragedy and despair. Although heartbroken, Woodruff continued to manage the plantation and to care for his children with help from Elizabeth. But the dark days were not yet over. On July 15, 1824, his only son, James, also died from yellow fever, and 2 months later, in September, Cornelia Gale was also felled by the dreaded disease. Woodruff's life would never be the same, but he managed to purchase the farm outright from his mother-in-law. She was quite elderly by this time and was happy to see the place in good hands. She continued to live at Laurel Grove with her son-in-law and granddaughter, Octavia, until her death in 1830. After Elizabeth died, Woodruff turned his attentions away from farming to the practice of law. He and Octavia moved away from Laurel Grove and he left the plantation under the management of a caretaker. He was appointed to a judge's position over District D in Covington, Louisiana, and he served in this capacity until April 1835. On January 1, 1834, he sold Laurel Grove to Ruffin Gray Sterling. By this time, Woodruff was living on Rampart Street in New Orleans and had changed the spelling of his last name to Woodruff. He had also been elected as the president of Public Works for the city. During this period, Octavia was sent to a finishing school in New Haven, Connecticut, but she returned home to live with her father in 1836. 2 years later, she married Colonel Lorenzo Augustus Bisankin and moved to his plantation, Oaklawn, 5 miles north of New Orleans. In 1840, the Louisiana governor, Isaac Johnson, appointed Woodruff to the newly created office of Auditor of Public Works, and he served for 1 term. Then, at 60 years of age, he retired and moved to Oaklawn to live with Octavia and her husband. He devoted the remainder of his life to the study of chemistry and physics and died on November 25, 1851. He was buried in the Girard Street Cemetery in New Orleans. Ruffin Gray Sterling and the Myrtles. In 1834, Laurel Grove was purchased by Ruffin Gray Sterling. The Sterlings were a wealthy family who owned several plantations on both sides of the Mississippi River. On January 1, Ruffin Gray Sterling and his wife, Mary Catherine Cobb, took over the house, land, buildings, and all of the slaves that had been bought from Elizabeth Bradford by her son-in-law. Since the Sterlings were leaders in the community, they needed a house befitting their social status. They decided to remodel Laurel Grove. Sterling added a broad central hallway and the entire southern section. The walls of the original house were removed and repositioned to create 4 large rooms that were used as separate ladies' and gentlemen's parlors, a formal dining room and a game room. Trips to Europe to purchase fine furnishings resulted in the importation of skilled craftsmen, as well. Elaborate plaster cornices were created for many of the rooms, made from a mixture of clay, Spanish moss, and cattle hair. On the outside of the house, Sterling added a 107-foot-long front gallery that was supported by cast-iron posts and railings. The original roof was extended to encompass the new addition, copying the existing dormers to maintain a smooth line. The addition had higher ceilings than the original house, so the second-story floor was raised 1 foot. The completed project nearby doubled the size of David Bradford's house, and in keeping with the renovations, the name of the plantation was officially changed to the Myrtles. For years after the completion of the project, Sterling died on July 17, 1854 of consumption, as tuberculosis was called at the time. He left his vast holdings in the care of his wife, Mary Cobb, who most referred to as a remarkable woman. Many other plantation owners stated, rather patronizingly from a 21st century point of view, that she had the business acumen of a man, which was high praise for a woman in those days, and she managed to run all of her farms almost single-handedly for many years. In spite of this, the family was often visited by tragedy. Of 9 children, only 4 of them lived to be old enough to marry. The oldest son, Louis, died in the same year as his father. Daughter Sarah Mulford's husband was murdered on the front porch of the house after the Civil War. The war itself wreaked havoc on the Myrtles and on the Sterling family. Many of the family's personal belongings were looted and destroyed by Union soldiers, and the wealth that they had accumulated was ultimately in worthless Confederate currency. To make matters worse, Mary Cobb had invested heavily in sugar plantations that had been ravaged by the war. She eventually lost all of her property. She never let the tragedies of the war, and the others that followed, overcome her, however, and she held on to the Myrtles until her death in August 1880. She was buried next to her husband in the family plot at Grace Church in St. Francisville. On December 5, 1865, Mary Cobb hired William Drew Winter, the husband of her daughter, Sarah Mulford, to act as her agent and attorney and to help her manage the plantation lands. As part of the deal, she gave Sarah and William the Myrtles as their home. The murder of William Winter. William had been born to Captain Samuel Winter and Sarah Bowman on October 28, 1820, in Bath, Maine. Little is known about his early life or how he managed to meet Sarah Mulford Sterling. However, they were married on June 3, 1852 at the Myrtles, and together, they had 6 children: Mary, Sarah, Kate, Ruffin, William and Francis. Kate died from typhoid at the age of 3. The Winters first lived at Gantmore Plantation, near Clinton, Louisiana, and then bought a plantation on the west side of the Mississippi known as Arbroath. 12 years after the death of Ruffin Sterling, and after the Civil War, William was named as agent and attorney by Mary Sterling to help her with her remaining lands, including Ingleside, Crescent Park, Botany Bay, and the Myrtles. In return, Mary gave William the use of the Myrtles as his home. Times were terrible, and Winter was unable to hold on to it. By December 1867, he was completely bankrupt, and the Myrtles was sold by the U.S. Marshal to the New York Warehouse and Security Company on April 15, 1868. 2 years later, however, on April 23, the property was sold back to Mrs. Sarah M. Winter as the heir of her late father, Ruffin G. Sterling. It is unknown just what occurred to cause this reversal of fortune, but it seemed as though things were improving for the family once again. The front porch of the Myrtles, where William Drew Winter was shot and killed. His murder was never solved, however. He did not, as the legends claim, stumble up the main staircase and die on the 17th step and NBSP. The front porch of the Myrtles, where William Drew Winter was shot and killed. His murder was never solved, however, he did not, as the legends claim, stumble up the main staircase and die on the 17th step. But soon after the death of Mary Cobb Sterling in 1880, the Myrtles was purchased by Stephen Sterling, one of her sons. He bought out his brothers, but only maintained ownership of the house until March 1886. There are some who say that he squandered what was left of his fortune and lost the plantation in a game of chance, but most likely, the place was just too deep in debt for him to hold on to. He sold the Myrtles to Orrin D. Brooks, ending his family's ownership. Brooks kept it until January 1889 when, after a series of transfers, it was purchased by Harrison Milton Williams, a Mississippi widower who brought his young son and second wife, Fanny Lynn Todd Harrelson, to the house in 1891. Injured during the Civil War, in which he served as a 15-year-old Confederate cavalry courier, Williams planted cotton and gained a reputation as a hardworking and industrious man. He and his family, which grew to include 7 children, kept the Myrtles going during the hard times of the post-war South. But tragedy was soon to strike the Myrtles again. During a storm, the Williams' oldest son, Harry, was trying to gather up some stray cattle and fell into the Mississippi and drowned. Shattered with grief, Harrison and Fanny turned over management of the property to their son, Sir Get Minor Williams. He later married a local girl named Jessie Folks and provided a home at the Myrtles for his spinster sister and maiden aunt, Katie. Secretly called the Colonel behind her back, Katie was a true Southern character. Eccentric and kind, but with a gruff exterior, she kept life interesting at the house for years. By the 1950s, the property surrounding the house had been divided among the Williams heirs, and the house itself was sold to Marjorie Munson, an Oklahoma widow who had been made wealthy by chicken farms. It was at this point, they say, that the ghost stories of the house began. They started innocently enough, but soon, what may have been real-life ghostly occurrences took on a life of their own. The myth of Chloe, the ghost that never existed. There is no question that the most famous ghostly tale of the Myrtles is that of Chloe, the vengeful slave who murdered the wife and 2 daughters of Clark Woodruff in a fit of jealous anger. Those who have been reading this chapter so far have already guessed that there are some serious flaws in this story, but for the sake of being complete, I included the tale here since it has long been told by owners and guides at the house. According to the story, the troubles that led to the haunting at the Myrtles began in 1817 when Sarah Matilda married Clark Woodruff. Sarah Matilda had given birth to 2 daughters and was carrying a 3rd child when an event took place that still haunts the Myrtles today. Woodruff had a reputation in the region for integrity with men and with the law, but was also known for being promiscuous. While his wife was pregnant with their 3rd child, he started an intimate relationship with one of his slaves. This particular girl, whose name was Chloe, was a household servant who, while she hated being forced to give in to Woodruff's sexual demands, realized that if she didn't comply, she could be sent to work in the fields, which was the most brutal of the slaves' work. Eventually, Woodruff tired of Chloe and chose another girl to force himself on. Chloe feared the worst, sure that she was going to be sent to the fields, and she began eavesdropping on the Woodruff family's private conversations, dreading hearing the mention of her name. One day, the judge caught her at this and ordered that one of her ears be cut off to teach her a lesson and to put her in her place. After that time, she always wore a green turban around her head to hide the ugly scar that the knife had left behind. What actually happened next is still unclear. Some claim that what occurred was done so that the family would just get sick and then Chloe could nurse them back to health and earn the judge's gratitude. In this way, she would be safe from ever being sent to the fields. Others say that her motives were not so pure and that what she did was for one reason only, revenge. For whatever reason, Chloe put a small amount of poison into a birthday cake that was made in honor of the Woodruff's oldest daughter. Mixed in with the flour and sugar was a handful of crushed oleander flowers. The 2 children, and Sarah Matilda, each had slices of the poisoned cake, but Woodruff didn't eat any of it. Before the end of the day, all of them were very sick. Chloe patiently attended to their needs, never realizing, if it was an accident, that she had given them too much poison. In a matter of hours, all 3 of them were dead. The other slaves, perhaps afraid that their owner would punish them also, dragged Chloe from her room and hanged her from a nearby tree. Her body was later cut down, weighted with rocks, and thrown into the river. Woodruff closed off the children's dining room, where the party was held, and never allowed it to be used again as long as he lived. Tragically, his life was cut short a few years later by a murderer. To this day, the room where the children were poisoned has never again been used for dining. It is called the game room today. Since her death, the ghost of Chloe has been reported at the Myrtles and was even accidentally photographed by a past owner. The plantation still sells picture postcards today, with the cloudy image of what is purported to be Chloe standing between two of the buildings. The former slave is thought to be the most frequently encountered ghost at the Myrtles. She has often been seen in her green turban, wandering the place at night. Sometimes the cries of children accompany her appearances, and at other times, those who are sleeping are startled awake by her face, peering at them from the side of the bed. I am sure that after reading this story, even the most non-discerning readers have discovered a number of errors and problems with the tale. In fact, there are so many errors that it's difficult to know where to begin. However, to start, it's a shame that the character of Clark Woodruff has been so thoroughly damaged over the years with stories about his adulterous affairs with his slaves, and claims that he had one of his lovers mutilated. Sadly, these stories have been accepted as fact, even though no evidence whatsoever exists to say that they are true. In fact, history seems to show that Woodruff was very devoted to his wife and was so distraught over her death that he never remarried. Before we get to the problem of Chloe's existence, we should also examine the murders of Sarah Matilda and her two daughters. In this case, the legend has twisted the truth so far that it is unrecognizable. Sarah Matilda was not murdered. She died tragically from yellow fever, according to historical record, in 1823. Her children, a son and a daughter, not two daughters, died more than a year after she did. They certainly did not die from the result of a poisoned birthday cake. Also, with this legend, Octavia would not have existed at all. Her mother was supposed to have been pregnant when murdered, but we know that she lived with her father, got married, and lived to a ripe old age. In addition, Woodruff was not killed. He died peacefully at his daughter and son-in-law's plantation in 1851. The key to the legend is, of course, Chloe, the murderous slave. The problem with this is that as far as we can tell, Chloe never existed at all. Not only did she not murder members of the Woodruff family, but it's unlikely that the family ever had a slave by this name. Countless hours have been spent looking through the property records of the Woodruff family, which are still available and on file as public record in St. Francisville, searching for any evidence that Chloe existed. It was a great disappointment to learn that the Woodruffs had never owned a slave, or had any record of a slave, named Chloe, or Cleo, as she appears in some versions of the story. The records list all of the other slaves owned by the Woodruff family, but Chloe simply did not exist. So how did such a story get started? In the 1950s, the Myrtles was owned by wealthy widow Marjorie Munson, who heard some of the local stories that had gotten started about odd things happening at the house. Wondering if perhaps the old mansion might be haunted, she asked around, and that's when the legend of Chloe got its start. According to the granddaughter of Harrison and Fannie Williams, Lucille Lorison, her aunts used to talk about the ghost of an old woman who haunted the Myrtles and who wore a green bonnet. They often laughed about it, and it became a family story. She was never given a name, and in fact, the ghost with the green bonnet from the story was described as an older woman, never as a young slave who might have been involved in an affair with the owner of the house. Regardless, someone repeated this story of the Williams family ghost to Marjorie Munson, and she soon penned a song about the ghost of the Myrtles, a woman in a green beret. The infamous staircase where witnesses report the sound of phantom footsteps, which stop on the 17th step, where William Winter died in the arms of his true love. Unfortunately, that event never happened. Winter died on the front porch and in the infamous staircase where witnesses report the sound of phantom footsteps, which stop on the 17th step, where William Winter died in the arms of his true love. Unfortunately, that event never happened. Winter died on the front porch. As time wore on, the story grew and changed. The Myrtles changed hands several more times, and in the 1970s, it was restored again under the ownership of Arlen Deese and Mr. and Mrs. Robert F. Ward. During this period, the story was greatly embellished to include the poison murders and the severed ear. Up until this point, it was largely just a story that was passed on by word of mouth, and it received little attention outside of the area. All of that changed when James and Frances Kermeen Myers passed through on a riverboat and decided to purchase the Myrtles. The house came furnished with period antiques and enough ghost stories to attract people from all over the country. Soon, the story of the Myrtles was appearing in magazines and books and receiving a warm reception from ghost enthusiasts, who had no idea that what they were hearing was a badly skewed version of the truth. The house appeared in a November 1980 issue of Life magazine, but the first book that I have found that mentioned the house was by author Richard Weiner. Both the magazine article and the Weiner book mentioned the poison deaths of Sarah Matilda and her daughters. As time went on and more authors and television crews came calling at the Myrtles, the story changed again and this time took on even more murders. In addition to the deaths of Sarah Matilda, her daughters, and Chloe, it was alleged that as many as 6 other people had been killed in the house. One of them, Louis Sterling, the oldest son of Ruffin Gray Sterling, was alleged to have been stabbed to death in the house over a gambling debt. However, burial records in St. Francisville state that he died in October 1854 from yellow fever. According to the growing legend, 3 Union soldiers were killed in the house after they broke in and attempted to loot the place. They were allegedly shot to death in the gentleman's parlor, leaving bloodstains on the floor that refused to be wiped away. One fanciful account has it that years later, after the Myrtles was opened as an inn, a maid was mopping the floor, and when she reached the spot where the bloodstains were, she was, no matter how hard she tried, unable to clean it. Supposedly, the spot was the same size as a human body, and this was said to have been where one of the Union soldiers fell. The strange phenomenon was said to have lasted for a month and has not occurred since. The only problem with this story is that no soldiers were ever killed in the house. There are no records or evidence to say that there were, and in fact, surviving family members denied the story was true. If the ghostly incident occurred, then it must have been caused by something else. Another murder allegedly occurred in 1927, when a caretaker at the house was supposedly killed during a robbery. Once again, no record exists of this crime, and an incident as recent as this would have been widely reported. The only event even close to this, which may have spawned the story, occurred when the brother of Fannie Williams, Eddie Harrelson, was living in a small house on the property. He was killed during a robbery, but this did not occur in the main house, as the story states. The only verifiable murder to occur at the Myrtles was that of William Drew Winter, and it differs wildly from the legends that have been told. As described previously, Winter was lured out of the house by a rider, who shot him to death on the porch. It is here where the stories take a turn for the worse. In the legend, Winter was shot and then, mortally wounded, staggered back into the house, passed through the gentleman's parlor and the ladies' parlor and onto the staircase that rises from the central hallway. He then managed to climb just high enough to die in his beloved's arms on the 17th step. It has since been claimed that ghostly footsteps have been heard coming into the house, walking to the stairs and then climbing to the 17th step, where they, of course, come to an end. Even after leaving out the ridiculous stories of the poisonings and Winter's dramatic death on the staircase, the history of the Myrtles is still filled with more than enough trauma and tragedy to cause the place to become haunted. There were a number of deaths in the house from yellow fever alone, and it's certainly possible that any of the deceased might have stayed behind after death. If ghosts stay behind in this world because of unfinished business, there are a number of candidates to be the restless ghosts of the plantation stories. And, if we believe the stories, the place truly is infested by spirits from different periods in the history of the house. There have been many reports of children who are seen playing on the wide veranda, in the hallways, and in the rooms. The small boy and girl may be the Woodruff children who, while not poisoned, died within months of each other during one of the many yellow fever epidemics that brought tragedy to the Myrtles. A young girl, with long curly hair and wearing an ankle-length dress, has been seen floating outside the window of the game room, cupping her hands and trying to peer inside through the glass. Is she Cornelia Gale Woodruff, or perhaps one of the Sterling children who did not survive until adulthood? The grand piano on the first floor plays by itself, usually repeating the same chord over and over again. Sometimes it continues on through the night. When someone comes